Hello. So we are on to a challenge. Styling a Tic Tac Toe board. So if you look at this, maybe you read through this, maybe you did not, but if you look at this image down here, you'll see what we're going for in this challenge. Look at that. That is an image of a thing. And that's what we want to build. So as you can see, I am scrolling all the way in this challenge. There's no video. That's because I'm making the video right now. So let's go ahead and make this video. Now, if you look at this image, this may seem pretty simple. It may seem complex. I'm not sure how it seems, but the reason we want you to go through this in part is because this is not strictly content. It's not a blog post. It's not a wall of text. It's not what you might traditionally think of when you think of a web page. It's something else, and eventually it can actually be a game. So the other reason is because later on when we get into TypeScript and we get more into UI programming, we can make this into an actual tic-tac-toe game. We can make it into one that you play against yourself, or we can actually build a simple computer player that'll play against you, and you can toggle that to make it more difficult or more easy or whatnot. But the point is, there's a lot we can do with this, even though right now it's just going to be something that doesn't move. It's just going to be completely uninteractive. You won't be able to click it. It'll be as interactive as this image right here. I'm clicking, and as you see, nothing is happening. So before we jump into the code, let's take a look at the sandbox real quick where we'll be actually building this. So when we want to start coding, we can just click into the sandbox over here. And right now I have it empty. You might have some stuff in here, or you might not. Just make sure that it's set to HTML, not some other option here in the menu. And then we can start coding. But before we start coding, I want to walk through how I might approach this problem and how many software engineers approach building something new like this. You have an image, or maybe you have an idea in your head, but you want something that is not on the web to become a bunch of HTML and a bunch of CSS. So going back here, back to the challenge. So let's look at this image. Let's just focus on this image entirely. And let's look at its structure. So at the simple level, we have a square, right? And we can imagine that this is probably going to be a div. We will have a div that everything else will go inside. And so specifically what's going to go inside it, we could slice this up in a number of ways. But one way we might do it is, we might say, well, here is a row, here is another row. Ignore my drawing skills here. And here is a third row. And within each row, and we'll ignore the X and the O right now, we have these other elements. Draw them out. And they look more like R's at the end there, but I'm trying to draw them quickly. So this is a basic structure. What I mean is I'm trying to think through in my head before I start writing what the structure of this might look like. It's often very tempting to just dive right into the code. And you can see this is actually just on my screen, the annotations there. It can be very tempting to just dive in and start coding. And that is not a bad idea. I would just say that it's not a good idea either. It might be the right approach for the situation, or it might not. And given that, I like to at least think through for, maybe 30 seconds, extremely quickly. Just think through what might this look like. And if that thinking process leads me to some conclusions, then I might go with that, at least initially. Oftentimes, you'll begin coding, and even if you plan things out initially, you'll have to make some changes. And that's totally fine. So given what I just said, given that structure here, let's go and look at the sandbox. So before we jump in here now, this is a guided project, so I'm going to code through this challenge completely here in the editor. But in order to learn, you're going to have to run into times when you don't know what you're doing. So I would highly recommend you pause the video and try to do this yourself. Come back in 10 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour, or come back in 3 after you think it gets annoying because your CSS isn't working. Either way is fine, but you'll learn more if you actually run up against situations where you don't know what's going on. So with that said, I'm going to pause real quick, give you an opportunity to write this up yourself, or stick around, and I will be back and we will code this up. Pausing, 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 pause. All right, and we're back. I know that I actually did pause the video there, so for me there was a small pause there, but for you, you might not have paused at all. Hopefully you did, hopefully you wrote something out here, but either way, we're gonna go through it now. So to start, I'll just draw up again what that structure looked like. So what I was thinking is there's gonna be a box. There's a box. And within that box, we're gonna have 3 rows. Let's draw some rows. There's a row. Here's a second row. And here's a third row. And within each row, we're gonna have some squares. These are the game squares. I'll start writing them more like ours, go really fast. So we have our layout here. And I'm just gonna leave it up there right now. And let's start coding based on that. So when we first start out, we're gonna need some style. We know that. We're gonna need to write some CSS. So I'm gonna open that style tag, and I'm gonna go ahead and blow the size up of this a little bit. So we've opened our style tag, and within that style tag, we know there are at least 3 things we're likely gonna want to style. Because looking at our layout over here, just drawn on the screen, there's going to be a box, there's going to be rows, and then there are going to be squares inside of it. So this outer box, I'm actually going to call the board, as in the game board. Call it board, and I'm just going to leave it totally empty. These are placeholders for where we're going to write code later. We're going to have rows, and so each row I'm going to give a row class. And we're going to have these squares or these cells, and I'm just going to call them square. So this is actually the basic structure of our CSS. We know we're going to have at least these 3 types of elements, these 3 classes, and so we can go on to the actual markup. Something I like about this approach is that this can, if you write out your CSS or your HTML first, you can go in either order. If you write out a basic structure, it'll often remind you when you're writing the other part, be it the markup or the CSS, what you were trying to write in the first place. So let's go ahead and start adding our elements. We're gonna have a div to represent the board. I'll just close that out first, open up, and give it the class. This is gonna be the game board, and inside of that, we're gonna need 3 rows. So when you need to do anything repetitive like this, you could just say div class row, not that, div. Okay, you could start here and take that, copy it 3 times. We could hit the pretty button to make our code more pretty, to make it formatted. And now we have our 3 divs. The thing is that now if we go in and we create the squares as well, we're gonna have to do it 3 separate times. So something I like to do in cases like this, if you're gonna have to write something repetitive and you know it's gonna be repetitive, just do it once, or get most of it done once, and then you can copy that whole thing afterwards. So in this case, let's get another div, and we're gonna give it the class of square from above. So now this one we can just copy 3 times, and the overall thing, the row, we can also get that, copy 3 times. I'm gonna go down here and hit the format button. There we go. All right, so here's the basic structure. And you may be wondering why there's nothing going on over here. In fact, I should probably get rid of that so that we see there's really nothing happening over here. And that's because there's nothing for the browser to show us, per se. The browser sees that we have a top level div, we have some divs inside of it, but none of these divs have anything that would show up visually. So there's just nothing on the page. Now let's try to fix that. So for starters, let's say our board, we can give our board a background color. make it teal. And you'll notice there's still absolutely nothing going on over here. And that's because the board doesn't have a width, it doesn't have a height, it doesn't have padding, it doesn't have margin, it doesn't have anything for the browser to actually assign pixels to. So the browser knows that if this board was showing any pixels, it knows what background color to make them. But it doesn't have anything to actually that take up any space on the screen. So we can address that by just adding some padding. Let's add some quick padding. 10 pixels. Now, this may look a bit odd, it's just a bar, but if we zoom in over here, we don't have a ruler on the screen, but what you would see if you were actually measuring this based on your own screen is that from here to here, this vertical space here is going to be 20 pixels because there is 10 pixels up here and 10 pixels down there of padding and absolutely nothing in between. So the two colors are just scrunched up together perfectly, which makes it look like a rectangle. Close that out, we'll zoom back out. So we could just give this, we could give some height, but that's no fun. Or rather, it is unnecessary. Let's focus more on the row and the square. So the row, we don't actually know what we're going to style here yet, so we can just leave that blank. And the square, however, let's actually give these squares a width and a height. So we're just going to decide how big these are. And if we go and look back at the picture, let's look at the picture, go hit the back button. So if we look at the picture, you can just eyeball these and use whatever value you think is right. I'm going to go with 50 pixels for the width and height. So I'll click forward again. Now we're back. So I'm going to say width 50 pixels. Still no change. Height 50 pixels. Whoa. So now you'll see there's a lot of height to this board, our game board here. Why is that? Well, in order to actually visualize what's going on here, these squares also should have some visual styling. So let's go ahead and give them, we know that we ultimately want lines on our board. So let's just go ahead and give these guys a border. A black border. And now you'll see here on the screen, we have these squares. And you'll also see that the line in the middle here is just slightly thicker. It is doubled up. The border of the top square is pushed up against the border of the bottom square. So it'll appear just slightly thicker. And that is totally expected and normal. But you also see that this isn't exactly the layout we were going for. So let us try to put these horizontally. We have 3 rows, and we want everything inside the row to display horizontally, rather than right now it's stacked vertically. So in order to do that, what we can do is we can use the ever useful CSS display property flex. Now watch what happens here when we go display flex. There it is. All of those are horizontal immediately. It's almost exactly the layout we were going for. Why is that? Well, you may see what's going on here, but to make it more clear, I'm going to go ahead and add some background colors to the actual rows so you can see what's going on. Often when you're writing CSS, it might not be exactly clear what's going on without adding some sort of superfluous styles that you'll end up removing, like this background teal that we have on the board up there. So I'm going to say these are rows. So I'm going to have an R1. I'm going to give it a background of, let's see, what's a nice background? Oh yeah, tomato. Tomato is a lovely background. And over here, go R1. And actually, I'm just going to run through and do these first. This will be R2. And this will be, you guessed it, R3. And coming back up here, R2, R2, background. And for this one, let's go with some lime. And for R3, let's go with a background of salmon. So we've got a We've got some pretty garish colors here that stand out nicely and serve well for instructive purposes. And also, we have a decent recipe over here for our rows. Now let's look at what's going on here. It looks sort of like a flag, right? We've got all these rows that extend way out past our squares. And what's going on there is basically display block. Nope, I don't think I zoomed. There we go. All the way zoomed out. What's going on here is the rows all have, well, in this case, not display block, display flex, which behaves like display block in terms of interacting with its parent element. In this case, the rows are all expanding to be as wide as they possibly can be, given the width of the board. The board also has display block. And I wrote it here just to emphasize, but it is the default property, so we can comment it out, we can delete it, and nothing will change because the board still has display block applied to it. And so the board is also trying to expand to be the entire width of its parent, and in this case that's just the body tag, which we haven't written here but which is present in the browser, and so it's trying to be as wide as possible. I just noticed also I forgot the very important box sizing. Border box up here at the top. This will save you so much headache, and you won't even know you're being saved headache, but that's the beauty of being saved a headache. Now, something that we want here is we want this to be less wide. We don't want it to actually take up the whole width of the page. And so one thing you could do, for instance, is you could say, well, each of these is what? This is this guy, that guy, that guy. See that? That doesn't show up very well with all of our lovely colors over here. So each of these is 50 pixels, which means that all in all, we have a width of 150 pixels here. So we could just tell the board to have a width of 150 pixels. But instead of doing that, let's use a display trick. So I'm going to remove these colors now that we saw the rows and saw what's going on there. And I'm going to say on the board, display property that isn't used that often, except it's very useful for this particular use case. We want to tell the board to be as wide as it has to be for everything it's containing, for all of its children, but not any wider. So in order to do that, we can just say display table. There you go. Yeah, that may be unintuitive. I certainly think it's very unintuitive, but using display table, instead of expanding to be as wide as possible, it'll actually shrink to be as narrow as possible without crunching anything inside of it. So in this case, all of these squares, all the squares over here, they all have a width of 50 pixels, so the board cannot go any smaller without shrinking the size of its children, and it's not going to do that. So another thing we can do, just to make it look a little nicer, is now that it's not fully wide, we can say margin 0 auto, center it on the page, and just to make it even more clear what would happen if this was display block, the board would be as wide as the whole window, so there would be no additional margin. It wouldn't be centered. Try that. See, the board is as wide as it can possibly be, and so there's no room for it to center anything. In this case, we would have to center all the rows within the board, but we don't want to do that. We just want display table. There we go. We have a nice board. I'm going to go ahead and remove this background teal while we're at it. I'm going to remove the padding while we're at it. So now we have the board for our game. So the last thing to do is add the X and the O. And the thing about the X and the O is that we want them to be reusable with any square. So if we had an X up here and an O over here, just like the example shows, that's great, but we also want to be able to, if we wanted, put an X here, put an X there, put an O here, etc., etc. We want it to be somewhat flexible. So the obvious thing we can do is we can jump in here and we can put an X, and we can jump in here and put an O. And that certainly works, and with a bit of styling this would look just like the example. But since we're really practicing CSS right now. I want to show you how you might do this with a different CSS property that is a bit odd. So instead of having the X and O, let's make it so that we can say has X is a class, and here we can say has O. This of course means we're going to need has X, we're going to need has O. So we're going to need these two classes, and they're going to be fairly similar, but not entirely the same, as you might guess from the fact that the X and the O were a different color in the example. Specifically, what we're going to look at right now is this thing called pseudo elements. So without adding any element here in HTML, we can actually add some content within CSS. What we can say here is, first thing, we have to use the pseudo element. Right now, hasX is referring to this div, the div itself. But every element in HTML has this pseudo element called after. That's odd. Isn't that odd? Maybe not so odd. And what this gives us is a way to use this property called content. Let's give that an X. Nice capital X. You'll see over here, we're getting an X in the browser. And we haven't modified this whatsoever. There's nothing here other than us saying has X. So down here, has X. Now that second one has an X. Bring it back. And we want to do the same for the has O. That has an O. So we could just call this done. This works just fine. We can say this one has an O. We can say this one has no, has O, and we can say this one does too, has O. Why can't I type right now? So that works just fine, but let's add a bit of style. And this allows us to get back into Flexbox a bit more. So we have our X's and O's, but first things first, we probably want them to be centered. So let's say, well, before I center them, actually, I want to say font size, let's see, big, larger than it is now. Let's say 40 pixels. And, oh, forgot a semicolon, very important. Font size 40 pixels, and let's do it down here, font size 40 pixels. Great. And yes, I forgot both of those semicolons. That looks much better. And actually what we can do is that these after selectors, they actually will inherit all the styling from the square. So we can save a line of code by taking this and moving that up here, and then we can take that away down there. And you'll see we still have these nice large letters. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's do a few more styling tweaks. Font size, let's use the nifty system UI. No? Ah, right, font family, not size. There we go, we've taken away the serifs on that font. Now we want to center this, so before we center it, actually, what was X? I think X was green. And let's go with lime. Lime is nice. And O was red, I think. Okay, good, we've got our colors. And now let's center them. So very quick and simple way to center things is to bring back Flexbox. So you saw we used Flex up here on the row. We can just use Flex on the square too and use some different properties. Say this display Flex. You'll see nothing's changed, but we want to say align items center and justify content center. There you go. It's perfectly in the center. And the reason we use both of these, actually, if we take away the 40 pixels, you'll see they're much smaller. So now let's take away the align items. You'll see that align items is moving them vertically to the center. And if we take away justify content, you'll see that it's moving them horizontally to the center. So there we go. We've got a nice tic-tac-toe board that looks close enough to the example. If you go back, you can compare, just hit that back button. And there's the X and the O, and it looks like when I made this, I used a serif font instead of the non-serif font that we have here. But there you have it. This is a walkthrough of making a UI that is currently completely uninteractive. But later on, once we know more TypeScript and more UI programming, we can come in here and we can make it so that clicking any of these will add an X or an O. But for now, we have this UI that does nothing, but it looks great.